So, the book that I read for our book report was Teaching History with Museums. So, let's start with a summary of the book. The book is broken down into 10 chapters. The first 2 chapters just sort of explain the history of museums and kind of how the book is going to work through its topic. And the last 8 chapters are all talking about different types of museums and how you can use them. And from types of museums, they're talking about artifact-based museums, living history museums, monuments, art history museums, historical houses, all sorts of things like that. And each different chapter has a different type of museum and a different way of using that museum in a history classroom. So, strengths of this book, it gives a lot of examples on how to use museums in your classroom. It also really is helpful in telling you how to properly support your museum trips and make them more than just a day off from learning, but to make it a day full of learning. The things that they strongly the biggest thing that it was repeated throughout the book was that you have to have pre and post activities that will support the museum trip. Also, it's really important to work with the museum staff and to visit the museum before you bring your students there. Those are the 3 main things that they said. Also, each chapter ends with a list of resources that can be useful for teachers to be able to use in planning museum trips. Some of the weaknesses of the book is that a lot of the examples are very, very specific. Like in each chapter, the examples they give are from a specific classroom, and a teacher with specific activities that they did before going to a specific museum, and then specific activities that they did afterwards. And while it's useful to see these examples, they're so specific that it can be a little bit hard to generalize them to broader means. And it also does not talk about logistical issues very often. It mentions that in some historical houses a lot of times will be smaller, so you won't be able to bring such large groups and there might not be enough bathrooms, so you have to plan for things like that. But it doesn't talk a lot about how to get approval for field trips, how to get funding, how to get chaperones for it. So I think that is one of the weaknesses of the book. Also, there's kind of a lot of overlap between the chapters and how, like I said, the 3 main things that just keep coming up are pre and post activities, talking to the museum staff, and visiting yourself. And those remain pretty consistent for all of them. And the differences between the chapters don't seem quite big enough to justify the chapters all being that separate. Connections to some things in our classroom. Well, first of all, I want to mention historical empathy. That's something that is brought up a lot of times throughout the book, is that museums can really help students develop historical empathy by being in the place where these historical events took place and just seeing those things. Something that I feel like connects more specifically to what our class has talked about is intrinsic motivation. Field trips can be fun. Going to museums should be fun for the students. They should be learning and thinking. But at the same time, the fact that they're somewhere cool and exciting and out of the classroom can be a lot of fun. It can be a really good opportunity for the students to be able to be intrinsically motivated to learn. So, obviously, history museums, it seems kind of obvious and how they would be useful in a history classroom, but there's actually a little bit more to how they can be used. For example, so history museums can inspire deeper historical thinking. And what I mean by that is that a lot of these teachers in the examples we're talking about having the students learn to think about how the history museums were put together, thinking about the bias of the curators and how they have limited space, so they can only choose certain artifacts to be displayed, and what narrative are they telling with these artifacts, and questioning, how all this stuff is coming to be. And so that is a big part of the historical thinking that history museums can help teach. Art museums was a pretty interesting one, because you don't necessarily think of that as a history as something for a history class or a social studies class, but art museums are really good for teaching about the culture of a time and how art like art almost always will reflect the culture of the time, and being able to figure out how that art and the culture connects can be really useful for history class. Monuments are another thing that's really good for teaching you about the time in which they were created, and like what were they memorializing, why did they choose to make this monument, who paid for it, what was their motivation in creating it. And being able to think about all these different things are just ways that the book mentions that these monuments can be used to help teach in classes. So because this is all about going to museums, I can't go to a museum, but the last chapter is about online resources and virtual materials that that a lot of museums offer these days. So we're going to go to the Smithsonian. We're going to the Smithsonian's virtual experience. So here we are. This is the Smithsonian. So as you can see, you can just kind of look around their exhibit and you can walk around. So here we are. And this can just be like, if you can't actually go to the Smithsonian, then this could be a way to for your students. And look, you can even read these plaques. So yeah, as a class, we're just gonna explore this exhibit about objects of wonder. So let's head over here and see what we can see. Let's see. So this is about linking nature and culture. Let's see what we have over here. Dressed to impress. Isn't this nice? And if you can go to a map up here and see, this is the first floor. Then we have shop. I don't know what that is. Here's the first floor. And we can go to different areas. Humans change the world today. Modern humans have spread to every continent and grown to huge numbers. So see, this is a pretty easy way. And it also, if you can see up here where my mouse is, it shows you where you've already been. So you can keep track and kind of make sure you know where you are and where you've been going. So, this is just one example of a way you can use a museum in your class. Now, finally, I'm supposed to say whether or not I would recommend reading this book. Honestly, not really. I mean, okay, it's a really interesting book, very helpful. I'm not gonna lie about that. But I feel like a lot of it is just a little bit redundant. There's at the very end of the book, Appendix A, which lists their 10 favorite strategies for using museums. And I feel like that is all that you really need from this book. So if you want to check it out, just flip to the back, look at those 10 strategies, and you've got basically everything that you need to know, in my opinion. Like the rest of the book is very interesting, and it wouldn't be a bad read, especially if you're interested in trying to figure out how to use museums in the classroom. But I personally just do not believe that you need to read the whole thing to get everything out of it.